And we're telling them, go out, launch this attack, get us a few kilometers of terrain. That'll show NATO and our donors that we're still alive. Well, it's insane. Makes no sense. And people in Washington and the NATO capitals are inhumane. This is beyond reason. This is no longer a war. This is just slaughter. And the sooner we understand that, the sooner we can end it. But we're not going to humiliate Russia. We're not going to subjugate Russia. The Russians are not going to bow down for forgiveness. Putin is not going to jail. There will be no regime change. This is all crap. And the problem is that we don't seem to understand that they're not the people who are responsible. We are. This could have been over quite early. You'll recall, I'm sure some of your viewers recall, that the Ukrainian negotiating team at the end of March, beginning of April said, yeah, we can live with neutrality, which was the principal concern the Russians have always had. They didn't want a NATO forward operating base on their border designed to attack them. Very simple. Well, that was rejected. And so here we sit. And everyone's convinced the Russians want to march all the way to Warsaw and Berlin. No, they don't. They are not interested in that at all. If they were interested in that, they'd be moving right now on Kiev. I think they're waiting to see what happens next, and then they'll move. But they don't want to govern Ukrainians. They know the Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. Mm-hmm. That was never the point. But now they've secured those areas that are Russian, that have Russians living in them. So they no longer are an oppressed people inside Ukraine. That was the number one consideration. And they're destroying this, they call it the neo-Nazi force. It's certainly a heinous group of people that have done terrible things to Russian prisoners and Russian people. No question about it. But, the Russians have done something very brilliant. They've always treated the Ukrainians that surrendered with great kindness. They have never mistreated the Ukrainians at all. And as a result, the Ukrainian officer looks around, he tries to evacuate the 50 wounded men that he's got. And they say, well, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We can't evacuate them. And so he says, I'm not going to let my men die. Calls the Russians say, of course. And this is happening. And it's not a surprise, but this army is broken. It's a broken vessel now. No amount of supplies are going to change that reality.
From what I've seen, that appears to be the truth. No amount of supplies, no amount of money is going to change the reality. And granted, a lot of those supplies and funds are being siphoned off to Ukrainian, oligarchs and elite. I'm curious, though. No one in the White House, no one in the State Department right now, maybe some in the Pentagon, are really looking for a way out, an off-ramp in this. And I know that's been the discussion all along. Where is the off-ramp? With the candidacy of President Donald J. Trump, someone who you served under as senior advisor to the Pentagon, do you feel hopeful in his plight to end this altercation, this war, within the first 24 hours? Do you think that that's actually possible?
Well, I think a number of things could be done quickly, and he could do them. But right now, his life is a living hell.
Yeah.
And I don't know what happens over the next several months. I wouldn't want to trade places with him under any circumstances. It's incomprehensible to me that we as a nation allow this nonsense to go on. The nonsense machine in Washington is out of control. But there are a couple of other things that need to be borne in mind. I don't think anybody in the administration, and even people at the top of the Pentagon, really understand that you don't build an army on the fly. You don't just bring in tons of equipment, put a lot of people on it, and say, all right, now you're an army. It's ridiculous. It takes a long time to do it. A general officer I served under, who's now passed away, he was a very great man. His name was Otis, General Otis, and he once said, the profession of arms is really very, very difficult. Building military power as we're trying to do it, and he was trying back in the early 80s, is very difficult to do it. He said, if it wasn't that tough, we'd contract it out. We don't get it. We've contracted the war out to Ukraine, literally. We've said, here's your stuff, here's cash. We've ignored the corruption. We've ignored the 60, 70,000 children that have gone missing as a result of this war. God knows where they are. We've ignored every conceivable ugly feature of this campaign with one goal in mind. We're going to destroy Russia. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. But for the neocons and the globalists, and they've blended into one cabal right now, this is an existential fight. If Russia survives and flourishes, well, your attempt to destroy the last European power that has a viable national identity, a real national language, a national culture, a history that cannot be rewritten, borders that will not open, that refuses to be assimilated by the rest of the world as opposed to preserving itself, will have been lost. They will have lost the fight. And see, they're looking at West Europe right now in terrible condition, economically, socially, as a huge success story. We've overrun France and Germany and Italy with all of these people from the Middle East and Africa and, Southwest Asia. This is wonderful. We're overrunning the United States. We used to talk about millions from Latin America. Well, they're now in the minority. We have people coming from all over the world. We don't know anything about them. They're unvetted. They're marching into the country unmolested. We hand them a little slip of paper that tells them when they're supposed to show up for their court date. It's a joke. Criminality is brimming. So, we in the West are a big success story for the globalists. And this was their one good shot at destroying the holdout, Russia, which is obviously evil. Now, that's a pretty stiff problem right now to deal with. And I think the way that the administration is trying to do it, and you can see this, Jackson, when you go into the New York Times and some of the other leading newspapers. Well, we've given the Ukrainians everything. There's not much more that we can do now. We've trained them. We've given them this. We've given them that. And I can already hear in the background, well, sorry, we gave you all we could. And, now it's time to turn attention to China. Oh, and by the way, China, that's a really big threat. Russia, well, it's not that big of a deal, but China, that's a really big deal. And nobody will stand up and say, well, if you don't like the fentanyl coming through the Mexican drug cartels into the United States, you don't go to war with China. You close the border.
Exactly.
You fight
Tucker
crime in America.
Yeah, I heard Tucker Carlson speak at in Palm Beach a few days ago. He made that point. He's like, how many Americans has Russia killed? 0, approximately, over the past several decades. What about Mexico through their fentanyl crisis? Tens of thousands every single year. And we don't go to war with them. We simply deal with it through policy and diplomacy. It's just crazy. But you talk about China there. I saw a story just yesterday. The Biden administration is now working to use the legal loopholes they created through this endless taxpayer-funded supply of military arms to Ukraine to now try supply arms to Taiwan, something that they've already been doing, and they've been training Taiwanese special ops in Taiwan, from what I understand, with U.S. troops. How quick do you think that might materialize? Because I know they have their eyes set on China. I remember, I think it was the first conversation we have, I asked you the question, what do you think about this war with China? And you said, war with China is a fundamentally stupid idea. And I don't know how many times I've played that clip on my show because it's so true. That's the last thing I think the American public needs right now.
Well, I don't think we're going to benefit from war with anyone at the moment, especially since the nation is at war with itself. We've been in a cold war with the left now for decades. It's now beginning to turn hot. I don't know how hot it's going to get, but that's a far more important fight right now inside the United States than anything happening everywhere else. China is a strange place. We don't understand China. China might as well be on Mars or Jupiter. That's how much we understand the Chinese and their civilization. It's one of the oldest civilizations on the planet. It's the last country in the world that wants to go to war with us. It absolutely does not. There are 1.4 billion of them, perhaps 4 versions of the United States living inside this place called China. If you go to war with them, they'll fight and they'll defend themselves. And most of their forces and their capabilities are all designed to defend China. No question about it. And you'll end up in a situation where you're sitting outside the largest fortress in human history. And instead of having an equally large and powerful force attacking, you're going to be a Lilliputian force, hurling rocks and boulders at this giant fortress and expecting something to change. It's absurd. It's a complete waste of time. Chinese are about business. They're about making money. They have enormous problems with corruption and organized crime. Every morning, I'm sure Xi wakes up and he worries about 2 things. First of all, how do I hold this monstrous country together? 1.4 billion. We can't even begin to imagine that. Secondly, how do I deal with all the corruption? Every other general in the People's Liberation Army has his own string of factories producing everything from rubber dinosaurs to microcircuits. Good Lord, what do we think these people are about? They recently arrested, they probably executed him. I haven't followed up the man responsible for shipbuilding because the hulls he was building for the PLA had cracks in them. They weren't.
Do you agree, disagree, not so sure on Donald Trump saying he could end this war in 24 to 48 hours? Do you agree with that? I mean, I think his, in my opinion, his political standing and his power, maybe, I don't know that it'd be 24 hours, but I think he could do it fairly quickly. Do you agree with that?
Well, I know the president, and, I have a great deal of affection for him, think very highly of President Trump. And I know that President Trump is very sincere about ending it. Saying I can stop it in 24 hours, it's hard to tell. I mean, obviously, he could walk in and say, I want an immediate ceasefire. Would the Ukrainians go along with it? Well, they might when you tell them that they're no longer going to be supplied with ammunition and weapons. And I think that's the first thing that he would do. He would stop that supply system from operating. Then I think he would order all U.S. personnel out of Ukraine. And we've got a lot of people in Ukraine right now that nobody talks about that are there to train and assist. They're part of headquarters from quote unquote NATO that are on the ground. We've had a number of people killed over there that nobody is talking about that have been kept concealed from the public. He would end all that. And I think if he made that very clear and the Russians saw that happen in 48 to 72 hours, then I think they would absolutely sit down and talk to us. Whether or not the Ukrainians would participate in that, I'm talking about the Ukrainian government now under Zelensky, I don't know.
So I do want to go one more thing on this topic, and I'm going to jump into a couple other things. I guess it's partly about this topic, but we talked about Taiwan, or we haven't talked about Taiwan, but our government has, and they treat Taiwan a little bit differently than they treat Ukraine. Why is that for people that don't understand? Well, in terms of China going in.
I regard Taiwan as something that's not of any vital strategic interest whatsoever to the United States, from the standpoint that it's not a place we should fight to defend.
Yeah,
I've never accepted that view. This is an island off the coast of China. It's got about 100 miles of water between China and it. The key thing about Taiwan, of course, for many people is this microcircuitry that is created there, which is essential to the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, us, even Europeans. It's a very high-end manufacturing. We should have that in the United States. By the way, when Trump was president, he was trying very hard to install a factory in Arizona that was essentially a branch of the one on Taiwan that produces this very sensitive microcircuitry. He was clearly aware of that, the importance of that. But I think there's this assumption that the Chinese are building themselves up for a major military assault, and there's no evidence for that. The Chinese are very powerful, but they're not fools. They know it's 100 miles of water. They also know that as soon as they take direct action against Taiwan, they will probably lose the support of everyone in Asia, because everyone in Asia will be horrified. And then finally, they know they don't have to fight for Taiwan. Why not? Because there are two political parties on Taiwan. There is one that is pro-Japanese, and that's the one that is in power. That is the party that has been courting us, trying to drag us in their defense. And then there is the KMT. This is Chiang Kai-shek's old party. Chiang Kai-shek was the Chinese general that led his nationalist forces to Taiwan when they lost the war with the communists back in 1948-49. That party is the pro-Beijing party now, because the Chinese, most of the Chinese on Taiwan and the Chinese inside China both want the same thing. They both want to live in a social structure that in many respects mirrors Singapore. Now, the audience doesn't know much about Asia, doesn't know much about Singapore. Many Americans would be horrified at that prospect, because Singapore, the government effectively controls and runs everything, but there is no interference with the making of money. In other words, it's probably a purely capitalist force in the purest sense of the word, but the government's not going to interfere with you as long as you don't break any laws. Well, that's Confucianism. That's culturally Chinese. The Chinese on Taiwan, the Chinese inside China can agree on that. That's why President Xi's timeline for 2047 being the year when the two would be reunified into one nation was acceptable to everybody, because the assumption was between now and then, we are going to grow ever more closely together. Yeah. Back in the early part of this century, I went to a war game. It was all connected with what was happening out in events in China and the off the coast of Taiwan and Korea and Southeast Asia. And what was very funny is we learned that the Chinese bankers on Taiwan had moved all of their holdings to the mainland for safety. And of course, when the crisis ended, they moved their holdings from the mainland back to Taiwan. I mean, who are we kidding? What do we think we're doing? This is nonsensical. The other thing is that everybody is against this idea of going to war with China over it. Koreans want nothing to do with it. They don't want to talk to us about it. They've got their own problems, and they want Chinese goodwill because they're sitting across from this dying state that is a hazard to everybody in the region, North Korea. Then you have the Japanese. They're not interested in going to war with China. Right now, they have so many interests in China, so many factories being built, so many production facilities. It would be catastrophic for them, and vice versa. The Chinese have now opened their markets to Japan. They never did that before. Xi has done that. The Japanese are exporting food. They're exporting all sorts of critical items to China. You're not going to get a war there, frankly speaking, unless we start it.
And I guess that's my confusion as someone that's, like I said, never been in the military. Why is it that these people want to start those things? And like you said, everybody else has their own problems. Korea has their own problem. North Korea, South Korea have their own problem. We have our own problem here too, right? Our problems, plural, right? You know, our southern border is porous. That's a problem, right? I mean, the wokeness in our country. You'll talk maybe in a little bit about this in the military, right? We have these issues across the country. People don't want to work. Inflation's high. Crime's high. Why is it that we can't just focus on America first and then worry about everything else after that?
Well, that was Donald Trump's view, obviously. I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. feels the same way. He's much more concerned about what's happening here, and he knows that there is no immediate existential military threat against the United States from China. He also knows, and just as Trump does, that we can deal with the problems that we have with China. You don't have to go to war with someone in order to curb their influence. And that was Trump's argument when he was in office.